Ireland 2022. Just under 10,000 people are homeless. 3,000 of those people are children. Many families who do have a home are struggling to keep afloat financially as well, with an increase in not only the cost of rent, but also the cost of living, including a rise in the price of food, fuel and electricity. Young people are struggling to move out on their own, often relying on their parents for accommodation well into their late 20s and early 30s. There have been reports of international students sleeping rough on our streets simply because they've nowhere else to go. Despite this, last year, over 90,000 homes laid empty, while housing developments, namely built-to-rent apartments, shoot up right across our urban centres. How is it that, despite this, we still have so many people unable to find a place to call their own? My name is Eoghan Gardiner, and in this two-part special of the Irish People podcast, we aim to find out. We'll do this by looking at the facts and the figures, the past and the present, and by speaking to a number of housing activists who are working to change the situation for the better. In this episode, we're going to discuss the housing crisis in terms of the impact that it is having on the ground, asking our guests about the situations that people are facing in their communities and the background behind it. In the second episode, we'll be focusing more so on what exactly is leading to this situation on a national basis and just what our guests believe the solutions are in order to change it. Join us. First of all, let's take a look at the housing crisis in Dublin city centre, which is now the sixth most expensive capital city in the world for renters. At the end of last year, a one-bedroom flat in the city centre cost an average of €1,643 per month. According to the rental site daft.ie, the average rent overall in the city centre lay at €1,996 around the same time. Claire O'Connor, the Workers' Party representative for the North Inner City, talks us through the situation and says that issues of overcrowding and poor quality accommodation are rife in the area.
Well, the current situation in terms of housing is really dire. I think this has been well documented and there's been a lot of talk about this. People are really suffering the effects of the housing crisis. Nationally, the country is in a state of emergency in terms of housing and has been really since the onset of the post-Troika recovery. So going back a few years, for example, as of March of this year, the figures are 9,825 people requiring emergency accommodation, almost a third of whom are children. And the inner city in Dublin Central is really at the raw coalface of this crisis because it's, I suppose, at the epicentre of our biggest urban centre, where the value of real estate is very high relative to other areas of Dublin. And what we're seeing in this area is not just the very clear problems in terms of accessing housing, in terms of people and families being denied homes, but also there are problems in terms of the actual quality of housing on offer. So a significant proportion of people living in the inner city are renting in the private rental sector. And one really big issue in the North Inner City is overcrowding. And we would have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, this manifest as a higher concentration of COVID cases on the north side of the city. So for example, the percentage of homes with 8 or more people living in them is 3 times higher in the Mountjoy Square area alone than the national average. And these places are so overcrowded that really social distancing was impossible. And there have also been some really egregious cases of groups of non-national workers and families or sections of other more marginalised and vulnerable cohorts of society being forced to live in these overcrowded housing arrangements around this part of the town, where they have essentially been, packed into tiny spaces by private landlords or slum landlords, as they've come to be known, without any due regard for their health and safety or for tenant quality of life, because there's just so little oversight or regulation in this area by the state. Another really big challenge in the area is excessive private for profit development, which is just cascading across the city like a cancer.
Claire believes that many of the developments that are going ahead in the area are faulted by virtue of their for profit nature. She says that housing can't truly serve people's needs if the primary driving force behind its development is profit. Claire is also critical of the lack of political will on a local basis to do anything about the many homes lying vacant across the city. In other words, landlords and developers are largely getting a free ride here, while at the same time, working people and their families are the ones suffering the consequences of this housing crisis.
And we've seen a proliferation in the number of hotels, luxury apartment blocks, finance office blocks, built to rent units, and private student accommodation units being built by private developers, even though these things have no real social purpose. So, for example, in relation to planning for student housing, the Workers' Party would have argued for an affordability criteria to be imposed where planning for student development was being granted. But in reality, large scale development in this sector in recent years has totally failed to ease pressure in the private rental sector because it's nowhere near affordable for ordinary students. And the same goes for the proliferation of luxury apartments and so on, many of which lie idle and vacant, and they've no social purpose for the working people of Ireland needing homes. They're built with the sole economic goal of turning a profit for massive global corporate landlord companies and their hedge funds and their investors and so on. And also, we've seen changes to apartment design standards in recent years, which were really railroaded by the Labour Fine Gael coalition government, which brought in, mandatory guidelines, new mandatory guidelines, which permitted co-living, build-to-rent units to be built and developed. And that there was a lot of talk about that, a lot of controversy about that. It's since been banned, and Minister Darragh O'Brien has brought in new regulations which seek to resign the existing regulations that permitted that. But despite his stated intentions on that, we still see, very small apartments being built in build-to-rent units, which are essentially not very different from what was proposed in the original co-living developments. And we've also seen some developers manage to evade that ban and still be granted planning permission for those. The other issue we see, not just in terms of housing, but also small commercial buildings along the main city streets, is an increase in the number of vacant, unoccupied buildings. And these are buildings that are just lying idle. They could be homes, they could be repurposed for that use if the political will were there. At the moment, owners of these buildings that are lying vacant for a prolonged period of time are meant to be paying fines to the council, but in reality, a lot of these fines go unpaid. They're not collected by the local authorities. And I think it's a very sad thing that we just don't see the political will there to act on the pure number and pure proliferation of vacant buildings around the city centre. So it's really quite something at the moment to take a walk across Dublin city centre and see this really stark inequality in housing. It's really like seeing neoliberalism on steroids, capitalism on steroids. We're seeing vacant luxury apartments around the IFSC and the Docklands, and they're overlooking, tent-lined streets where homeless people are literally dying in the cold.
Claire views what the government, both local and national, are doing on housing in the North Inner City area as fundamentally inadequate. O'Devany Gardens, for example, was first built as a social housing complex in the 1950s and at one stage accommodated a working class community of over 1,000 people. In more recent times, however, there has been a fight between local residents and the council over whether or not the site should be sold off to private developers. As the price of rent would likely be in tune with that of the Dublin rental market, local people would probably be priced out of their own community, while also leaving more people without a home, as Claire explains.
I think the political will on this has been really lacking. And you mentioned O'Devany Gardens there, Owen. I mean, nowhere symbolises Ireland's housing crisis better than O'Devany Gardens, in my view. This was a prime site of public land, that could have been used to provide affordable and secure homes for working families around the Dublin North Inner City area. And instead, what happened was it was sold off to a private developer. And that decision was made in large part by the political establishment, by councillors that represented establishment parties on the local authority. And yet again, we saw basically private profit being put ahead of the needs of working class communities. And I suppose the Workers' Party had a very specific interest in this because our Workers' Party councillor at the time, Eilish Ryan, was very involved in this issue. She really led the campaign to keep O'Debony Gardens in public hands, so the campaign against it being sold off to Barter Capital. In 2016, she successfully passed a motion on Dublin City Council for 100% mixed income public housing on the site. But what we saw was that the political establishment essentially rallied to make sure that this motion was overturned and the land handed over to the developer. And this was kind of sold to the deal, this deal was kind of sold to the local community. It was sold to the local community on the basis that it will provide affordable and social housing. But this never materialized. And if you talk to people around that part of the North Inner City, around the community today, you'll see that people never really bought that. You know, what we saw instead was that the privatization of a key piece of public land would only, deliver homes that are really well beyond the reach of many working families. And that's kind of been further confirmed recently by the decision of An Bord Pleanála to lift a ban on institutional investors for the site, which essentially means that there could be bulk buying here, which has opened the door for cuckoo funds to come in. And we know that will mean that there will be no affordable housing delivered on this site in practice.
It is no secret that many young people find it difficult to move out of their parents' house and to find a place of their own. In fact, in 2019, the Growing Up in Ireland study found that most 20-year-olds rely on the help of their parents for basic living expenses such as food, housing and utility bills. That same study also found that housing was their greatest concern. In South Dublin, for example, the average annual price of rent comes to €22,812, which is almost €1,000 more than somebody working full-time on the minimum wage would earn in that time frame. Sticking to Dublin's north side, however, I spoke to Joe Johnston, a Workers' Party member and housing activist. Joe has recently managed to move out of his parents' home, but finds himself still struggling financially as a result, as he explains. Yeah, so as a young person, Joe, how difficult is it, do you think, to move out and get a place of your own?
Nearly impossible. Rents are only going up. It's getting harder now. I managed to move out, but I found a cheap enough place compared to the rents around me. But all my mates still stuck at home with their mas and dads. And it's only getting worse. Like, the cost of living's going up, standard of living's going down. And if you do manage to move out, you're really only living paycheck to paycheck. Like, you're never going to be comfortable as a young person moving out. So,
in addition, Joe, who had been living with his parents in Fairview prior to the move, now finds himself living in Stoneybatter. Despite having little choice but to move away from his local community, Joe considers himself quite fortunate just to have been able to afford somewhere in the same city as them. Did you manage to sort of move close to where you're from originally? Because I know that's a big problem. People are finding that they have to move. Well, they have to take whatever they can get, basically, and that could be moving down the country. It could be moving over the other side of Dublin. It could be moving anywhere, really.
I'm about half an hour, 40-minute bus ride. Luckily enough, there's a bus that takes me to where my man and dad living. So got lucky that way, and I'm close enough to work. But still, it is a big move. Like, I'm not as close to my mates anymore as I used to be.
Joe also takes issue with the privatised nature of housing development in Ireland. The priority for private developers, Joe says, often leaves communities lacking infrastructure and facilities. do you think that there's much of a sort of discrepancy between sort of basically when housing developments are built, they tend to be in Ireland anyway, just the housing development itself has to be built. Whereas in Europe, for example, in Vienna in particular, it's sort of standard that the infrastructure has to go in, and that'd include transport.
Yeah, especially since a lot of the housing is being built by private developers. They only care about getting the houses up. There's not much consideration put into even like playgrounds for kids nowadays, or as you said, public transport. There's just a lot of facilities just not being thought of because all they're thinking about is getting these houses up and make a profit off them.
Despite the move, Joe still tries to spend as much time as he can in his native Dublin Bay North constituency and takes issue with a number of the private housing developments supposedly designed to alleviate the housing crisis somewhat in the area. He says that many of these sites are built on land that was once publicly owned, meaning the state could have built actually affordable housing on the land itself instead of leaving it up to the forces of the private market. Yeah, what do you make of the housing developments that are being built and proposed at the moment? Do you see them as any sort of solution, though?
Now, as I already mentioned, they're all only private corporations making them on land that was public land that the state sold off, because at the end of the day, the government isn't concerned about building public housing at all. As they're neoliberal parties, so obviously all they're concerned about is the private market making the private market making profit. Like even in the area I'm based in, Dublin Bay North, you had the likes of the Shiver site where the state sold, or the Dublin City Council sold a large plot of land to I forget the name of it, but it was a private developer, and for 2.5 million. The moment it was originally commercial, zoned for commercial use, but the moment they rezoned it for housing, the company decided just to sell it off without even building houses at where they were looking for about 25 million, I think. In another part of Dublin Bay North, the Oscar Traynor Road, there's been a lot about that lately, but selling that off, public land, selling it off to private developers, they could easily have built affordable social housing on that land, but now they want to sell it off to private developers to make unaffordable housing that working class families will never be able to afford.
Joe's of the opinion that this housing crisis is no chance occurrence, but that it comes from ideologically driven neoliberal politicians in power who prioritise the private market and private profits over the needs of working people and their communities.
Like, it's not an accident. Yeah, it's not an accident that we have this housing crisis. It's decades of neoliberal parties just putting in policies and not caring about the working class people. It's just caring about getting as much profit as possible from anything they can. And in this case, they've turned a house, which should be looked at as a home and a human right, and they've turned it into a commodity and a way of just like trying to extract profit.
Next, I spoke to David Gardiner, the Workers' Party representative in Palmerstown Fonthill, an area to the west of the city which falls under the remit of South Dublin County Council rather than Dublin City Council. Despite this, many of the problems with housing remain the same right across the city. Palmerstown Fonthill, as David explains, could be considered quite diverse in terms of the housing, but he believes that the people there, many of whom are struggling with regards to housing, have more in common than might be obvious at first. Could you give us a bit of background to the housing situation in Palmerstown Fonthill?
Yeah, so Palmerstown Fonthill is made up of Palmerstown, Knockan and parts of Lucan. The vast majority of the housing in Palmerstown and Lucan would be privately built or privately owned, whereas a lot of the housing in Knockan would be social housing. The interesting thing for those of us in the Workers' Party, though, is that people who've grown up in either private or social housing all have something in common. They're all struggling to move out of their parents' houses. The price of rent is skyrocketing when you compare it to how much money people earn, And that's without even taking into account necessities like food, energy, petrol, and just other living day-to-day expenses for socialising, if at all possible. Many of the young people who've grown up in the area have little choice but to either stay living at home or move down the country. The Workers' Party believes that people do have a right to stay living close to the area and the community that they're part of, to help them in family life if they have kids or babysitting needs or anything, just family support. This has proven very difficult for many people looking to move out. The people here, be they in Palmerstown, Lucan, Auckland, all have to work for a living at the end of the day. Despite them being hard-working people, they're still struggling to get by.
David is primarily based in the Palmerstown end of the constituency, where there are a number of housing developments both underway and proposed. However, he takes issue with the fact that these are largely private built and built for rent. He also believes that there is a lack of infrastructure in the area to support these plans, and that the plans themselves make no provision to provide for it.
Down in Palmerstown village, you have the development of the old Vincent Bourne site. This will be a minimum of 250 units being built there, with the developers looking to increase that figure to 274. When such large-scale developments like this are planned, it's essential there are enough amenities are there and infrastructure in place to facilitate a growing community. This simply isn't the case in Palmerstown. Anybody who lives in the area, especially around the village where the Vincent Bourne site is, could tell you there is quite serious traffic problem in the village. The Vincent Bourne site is situated right beside the Palmerstown Chapel Lizard bypass, meaning it is literally the link between Dublin and many of the surrounding counties and the west of Ireland. So it's no surprise that there is a traffic problem. However, nobody in charge, be it the council, An Bord Pleanála, or the developers themselves, seem too bothered about solving this problem. They're happy enough to add to it. At the industrial estate on the Kensford Road, just across from Palmerstown Manor, developers want to put in 144 built-to-rent apartments. In line with the Dublin rental market prices, people would struggle to afford these apartments, and again there is minimal effort being put into making sure that we have the infrastructure and amenities to facilitate this growth. Developments like these are designed solely to make money for the developers and landlords. They couldn't care less how this will impact working people. New apartments should be built as part of a wider plan, including infrastructure, libraries, amenities for Palmerstown, or any area that these apartments are being built. And these should be delivered before the residential development. This is the norm in many European countries. The rental market in Dublin is extortionate, and Palmerstown is no exception to this. These plans are just cash grabs by developers and landlords at the expense of renters and the community. We stand against these developments, not only for our sake as residents, but to show that high cost housing with a lack of facilities in an area is no way to solve the housing crisis.
David also told me that Palmerstown is by no means unique in this regard, as similar plans have been proposed for neighbouring suburbs such as Lucan. He stated that these private developments are not any sort of solution for the housing crisis. Instead, he believes that they are the housing crisis, and that this is being replicated right across Dublin, if not the country as a whole. The impact of Ireland's housing crisis is not only felt in Dublin, of course, but right across the country. Indeed, it stretches across the border, where people are facing similar problems to what we've discussed so far. To get an insight into this, I spoke to Gemma Weir, the Workers' Party representative in North Belfast. Although there are many similarities, Gemma also explains how the housing situation differs in the North and how it is further complicated by the sectarian nature of politics there.
Okay, well, at the moment in Northern Ireland, we have up to 40,000 people who are on the social housing waiting list. As you can imagine, the detrimental effect on people's mental health, being stuck in a limbo stage of waiting for a house, you know, it's not good. It doesn't help matters that in Northern Ireland as well, the housing stock is so poor, and so there's such a low amount of it. And then also the plan of, of how to kind of regenerate it and increase that isn't very good either. So in Northern Ireland, you have the Housing Executive, which is the government body, but you will also have then community-run housing associations that will build social housing in each area. Okay, so it can be quite complicated in the way that it's made up, but that's Belfast and Northern Ireland for you. If it isn't complicated, why would we want to do anything? One of the other things as well that faces, that it is a major issue with housing would probably be, empty homes, social exclusion, and then the legacy of the Troubles doesn't help either. We would have a very segregated housing, especially social housing stock. So with social housing, majority of it is either in one area or another, and there's very little integrated housing. That would be something that the Workers' Party would be very much in favour of, and any new homes should really be being built on an integrated basis, and having people living side by side, colour, creed, religion, everything. And that would be really, really important. But unfortunately, with the executive at the moment, it doesn't suit them to do that. It is, it has been put about where you would have, I don't know if you would know very much about this, is what we call shared housing. A good example of that would be the Garwood Housing Hub in North Belfast. It could have been a really, really good blueprint of how to do integrated housing, and it was missed. What they did in the end was they built social housing for, for want of a better word, a nationalist community. And they also built houses for the loyalist community, and in the middle of it, they put a sports centre as almost like an unofficial peace line. And then they tried to say that this was shared housing, which it isn't.
As all of our guests from Dublin so far have cited an over-reliance on the private sector to provide housing as the key issue, I asked Gemma if she thought that this was also the case in the north. However, Gemma believes that a lack of centralisation in terms of housing planning causes more of a problem there, and that a dysfunctional housing executive could very well see housing fall into the hands of profiteers.
Well, there wouldn't be just as much. I suppose the housing associations that you would have running in each area, they are usually community based and community run, and they do have the best intentions, in place. But the problem is when you have so many different housing associations and they don't really link up, then you'll have one doing one thing, one doing another. And really, we have got the housing executive, which should be doing all of these things. It shouldn't have to be going any further. We actually do have the body in place to build homes and to provide these, but it's not working. And in a way, it is kind of systematic of what happens in any place, but it's almost the running down of the housing executive. It's you would almost think they're trying to make it fail, because then it can be done away with, and that wouldn't be in government hands anymore. And that's something that has to be fiercely fought at every corner. And also, I think it's as I said before, a lot of it does come down to as well the unwillingness from the political parties to work and find a solution, because you will have at certain times there has been housing issues, and it will affect certain communities more so than others. And it's really, that's when you need the political will of all parties to work together to try and get a solution. And that doesn't happen. To give you an idea, another kind of an example would be there's a site on the Springfield Road, the Mackey site, and it did used to be an industrial site, and it would be absolutely prime for social housing, especially in an area like West Belfast, which the need for it is colossal, and it's sitting empty and nothing has been done, and the political will just doesn't seem to be there to do it. You'll hear things about it maybe being earmarked for industrialization or more kind of manufacturing, when really at the moment in that area, housing is what is needed for the people.
As with many issues in northern politics, sectarianism even rears its head into housing. There has been opposition to development of social housing on the Mackey site that Gemma mentioned, with some claiming that this opposition, typically when it comes from the bigger nationalist and unionist parties, is often based on not wanting to build housing in parts of the city that they don't see as their own. In other words, it would be housing that they don't see their respective sectarian voting blocks getting to take advantage of.
Well, that's the thing, you will hear exactly, you'll hear those things. You don't know if that's going to be the case, because it comes down to when the houses are built, who's on the list, who needs them, and especially if it was to be, it would be in an area that could be made an integrated housing association, not a housing association, an integrated housing development, because it is on what would be kind of a bit of a peace line. And it can be done. These things have to be tried, they have to be moved forward, and everybody has to encourage people to do it, instead of retreating into our own communities, or as people have done historically, and just wanting to live very separately.
That concludes the first episode of our two-part special on Ireland's housing crisis. In the next episode, I'll be asking our guests what they believe the solutions are to the problems that they've laid out for us so far. Make sure to follow the Irish People podcast on your favourite streaming platform to ensure that you don't miss any future episodes. My name is Eoghan Gardiner, and thank you for listening.